Nobody talks about the generation that raised itself. We spend years analyzing boomers and their work ethic. We write entire books about millennials and their anxiety. We debate Gen Z constantly. But there's a generation sitting quietly in the middle, one that watched both of those conversations happen and said nothing. Not because they had nothing to say, but because asking to be heard felt somehow wrong. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, statistically the smallest adult generation in America, and almost certainly the most psychologically overlooked. By the end of this video, you'll understand why they became that way, and why the silence isn't what it looks like. It is 1974. You are 9 years old. You come home from school to an empty house. You use the key hanging around your neck, the one your mom put there because she started working full-time after the divorce. You make a sandwich. You turn on the TV. You figure it out. No one asked how you were doing, not because they didn't care, but because the world they were managing didn't leave much room for that question. Divorce rates in the United States doubled between 1960 and 1980, peaking in 1979 at levels the country had never seen before. Gen X children watched the institution of family restructure itself in real time. According to research published in the Journal of Marriage and Family, children raised during this period experienced significantly higher rates of household instability than any previous generation, not through poverty alone, but through the emotional volatility of adults navigating profound social change. What a 9-year-old does with that instability is this: they learn to need less. Needing less becomes survival, and survival, practiced long enough, starts to feel like identity. Layer that forward a decade. It is 1983. You are now a teenager. MTV launched 2 years ago. Reagan is on television. The news mentions something called AIDS and something called crack, and the adults around you seem frightened in a way they're trying not to show. There is a pervasive cultural message threading through the music, the movies, the after-school specials, and it sounds something like, "You're on your own, kid. Good luck." The films Gen X grew up watching didn't feature mentors who showed up reliably. They featured teenagers outrunning danger alone, outsmarting adults, solving problems that grown-ups couldn't handle. John Hughes didn't make those movies by accident. He made them because they were true. Psychologist Jean Twenge, in her research on generational cohorts, noted that Generation X developed unusually high levels of self-reliance alongside unusually low levels of institutional support. They didn't distrust systems because they were cynical. They distrusted systems because systems had given them real, repeated reasons too. A child who learns early that adults are unreliable doesn't grow into someone who asks for help. They grow into someone who considers asking for help a kind of foolishness. And here's where it gets complicated, because here is the paradox that psychologists took a long time to name. Generation X is statistically one of the most quietly resilient generations in modern American history. A 2019 report from the American Psychological Association found that Gen X adults reported lower levels of happiness than both boomers and millennials, but higher levels of adaptability and stress management competence. They were not thriving emotionally. They were functioning exceptionally, and they had almost no language to distinguish between the two. This is the twist. What looked like strength was, in many cases, a learned suppression of need so deep it became indistinguishable from stoicism. Research on attachment theory, particularly work building on John Bowlby's foundational studies at the Tavistock Institute, shows that children who experience inconsistent caregiving often develop what's called an avoidant attachment style. They become high-functioning, emotionally self-contained, and genuinely uncomfortable when others try to help them. Not because they don't need help, but because needing help became neurologically associated with disappointment. They don't ask because somewhere in childhood, asking didn't work. Watch a Gen X adult in a workplace today. They are probably the person who solves the problem before anyone notices there was one. They don't send the email asking for clarification, they figure it out. They don't go to HR about the thing that's been bothering them for 8 months. They handle it or they leave. Research on workplace communication patterns, including studies by organizational psychologist Adam Grant, have documented that Gen X employees consistently underreport stress and overperform under pressure, not out of ambition, but out of deeply ingrained self-sufficiency. In relationships, it looks like this. They show love through action, not words. They fix the thing rather than discussing the feeling behind the thing. Their partners sometimes interpret this as emotional distance. It isn't. It is the language they were given, the language of a generation that expressed care by showing up and quietly handling what needed handling, because no one taught them there was another way. What gets missed in every generational conversation about Gen X is what that kind of formation actually produces. Yes, it produced people who struggle to ask for help, but it also produced the generation that kept the lights on. They were the managers who held companies together through 2008, the parents who swore they would be more present than their parents were, and largely kept that promise, the friends who showed up with food instead of words when something went wrong. Sociologist Neil Howe, who co-developed the theory of generational archetypes, described Gen X as a reactive generation, one shaped by adversity into a kind of pragmatic, unsentimental competence that society benefits enormously even when it goes unacknowledged. They don't need acknowledgement. That's the whole point. They never learned to wait for it. There is a particular kind of strength that only forms in people who were handed a key and told to figure it out. It isn't glamorous, it doesn't photograph well, it doesn't ask to be seen because it was built in a world where being seen wasn't reliably safe. But it is real, and it has held more weight, quietly, steadily, without complaint, than most generations will ever know. Generation X didn't fail to ask for help because they were broken. They didn't ask because for a long time, no one was home to answer. The key around their neck wasn't just a key. It was the first lesson in a long education about what they could rely on, themselves. If this landed somewhere real for you, consider subscribing. More videos like this come out regularly, and if you want to support the work, the join button genuinely helps.